Two men decided that they were going to go on a hunting trip in a very remote section of Alaska. But it wasn't long before they found something that solved a very strange case. But before we begin, if you're a fan of true crime stories delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do. And I try to upload once a week. But with all that being said, let's begin. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty police officers went hunting in a remote section of Alaska. To give you an example how remote this place was, the only way you can get there is via boat or plane. So generally, the only people that came here were very serious hunters. So after a long day of hunting, the men decided that it's time to go home, and they got to a section of the island where there was a river, and they were walking along this river until something stopped them, and whatever that was, they started staring at it, and what they saw was a boot sticking out from the sand. But it was not just the boot, there was a human bone sticking out from the boot. So the officers knew that they stumbled into something bad, and they didn't want to get too close just in case they potentially destroyed some evidence. So they quickly reported the boot to the department, and then the next day the department came and painstakingly unearthed the boot. As they got majority of the boot out, a body came along with it, and the body still had women's clothing on. So as they examined the body, they realized that the bones were shattered, almost like a gun penetrated through them. So they started to search the area just in case if there's any bullets or guns nearby, and lo and behold, there was a shell casing that belonged to a 23 caliber round, which in the hunting world is very common, as hunters would always use these type of bullets as they're cheap and they're easy to use. So now that they gathered up the information, they took the body and sent it to an autopsy, and when the details came back to the police, they found out that the body was belonging to a female, and that the body had been laying there for 6 months and was definitely some sort of homicide to it. The autopsy also found out that the clothing that the woman was wearing had no bullet holes in, which means whoever shot the girl must have took her clothes off and then put them back on after she died. Also, what the autopsy found was a hospital badge around her arm. They presumed it was used to blindfold her before she ultimately got shot. And a couple of days later, dental reports came back and they found out that the woman was 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage, who at the time of her discovery, she had been missing for 10 months. The last known thing about her was when she told a friend for $300 she was going to get some photos taken of her by a professional photographer. So she went to meet the man, and then unfortunately never came back. Now police speculated whoever that photographer was probably the one to kill Sherry, but of course they didn't have any evidence to allow them to search for this person. All they had was a shell casing from a hunting rifle, and now Alaska is known for having thousands of hunters, so the police were pretty stumped on who it could have been. So the police would release these findings to the public in hopes of someone knows something or could help them. A reporter asked the police that maybe this death is related to another mystery unsolved in Alaska, which he was referring to 2 years ago. There was 2 bodies found near where Sherry's body was found, and one of the bodies was really decomposed and he couldn't identify who it was, but the other body was identified to be Joanne Messina, who was 24 years old. She was also an exotic dancer. So the fact that both were exotic dancers and both were walking down Anchorage at the late nights, most likely near the same street, so this is why the media thought these two could be related. But the police informed everybody that they believed that these cases are not connected at all, but even some officers had doubt in their minds. And not to mention, in the past couple of years, an alarming rate of women were going missing in Anchorage, so people began to worry that there might be a serial killer on the loose. And after a year of no evidence of Sherry or the 2 other women, people began to click on that even more women were going missing. So now the full city is going in panic mode. People are now starting to believe that someone is abducting these women. But in a stroke of luck, police found a break in the case. On June 13th, 1983, in the early mornings, a man driving his truck turned onto a quiet highway in Anchorage. He was relaxing and listening to music before suddenly he saw something running towards him. As it got closer, he saw a woman, hands over her head. She wasn't wearing any pants or shoes, so the truck driver knew something bad had happened. So he slows down and lets the woman come close to the truck. And when she came to the window, he noticed that the woman was very young. She looked like to be in her early 20s. So as she was pleading with him to let her inside the truck, he looked around and he realized that how could she get here? Because remember, this is a quiet highway in the middle of Anchorage. So as he said yes, the woman flung herself in and then began to hide under the chair, almost like she was hiding from something. And as she was doing that, she was screaming at him to just drive. So the man wasn't taking any chances. He just put the car in drive and then sped off. So as they were driving, the man kept on glancing at the girl and she was just saying, "Please drop drop me off at the motel, non-stop. So the man listened and then dropped her off at the nearest motel. So as they're a couple of minutes away from the motel, the man looks at the girl again, and then he asks, do you need any money for the motel? She looks at him and then says, no, I already have a room at this motel. So once they get to the motel, the girl just takes off running inside the motel. So you have to imagine you're the receptionist at the motel. You look to your left where the door is, and you see a girl half clothed and a handcuff on her wrist, running straight towards the elevator. So it wouldn't take long before the receptionist called the police, and then a few minutes later they would arrive and head up straight to the girl's room. They knocked on the door and very slowly the girl opened the door, but with some convincing the girl allowed the police to come inside. So the police asked her what's her name and also asked her age, because the police also noticed that she looked very young, and she told them her name was Sydney Paulson and she was 17 years old. Now at this point the police knew that the girl was terrified and she was just shaking uncontrollably, and she wasn't really going to be a threat. So they removed the handcuffs from her hand, and then she would proceed to tell the police her gruesome story. And then later on the police would tell investigators that her story was just truly horrific and gruesome. So the story goes that Sydney was working on the streets of Anchorage, and she was walking around until a car pulled up next to her, and inside the car there was a man with a decent sized beard, and he was wearing glasses, and she told the police officers that he seemed harmless, and he also asked to buy her services. And of course again, she didn't really see him as a threat, so she said okay. So she went around the car and hopped inside the passenger side of the car. But as soon as she sat down, the bearded guy reached over and then put a handcuff on Sydney's arm. And the handcuff was attached to the inside door handle, so Sydney was essentially stuck. And then just as quick, the guy pulled out a gun and told her not to move, not to say anything. So of course, fearing for her life, she complied, and then the guy proceeded to drive on. He got to a fairly nice neighborhood when he decided to stop and then pull into a house. It turns out the house was the bearded guy's house. So he gets out first and then goes around and then tells her to get out, and leads Sydney straight into his house and down to the basement. As they were walking down step by step down to the basement, Sydney noticed how dim the basement was, and there was just a lot of miscellaneous stuff around. Until they got in, she looked to the left, and there was a chain hanging from the ceiling. So now Sydney begins to get lightheaded, and then's coming to the conclusion that this man's gonna kill me right here and there. So as she's trying to walk, she stumbles, and then the bearded man violently pulls her and then hangs her on the chain on the roof, and then for hours on end he begins to assault her. After he began to get tired of assaulting her, he decided that enough's enough, and now he wanted to go upstairs and catch some sleep. And just before he was about to go upstairs, he looked at her and told her that they were going to go on an adventure to his cabin in the woods. So now Sydney's just screaming for help and trying to get herself out of this restriction. So as she's screaming and shaking violently, the man quickly runs up to her face and proceeds to tell her, if you keep this up, I'll kill you, and it won't be very quick. And then just as quick, he walked upstairs and locked the basement door. And now for hours, Sydney's just strung up in the ceiling, wondering what's going to happen to her. And just a couple of hours later, the man came down and untied Sydney, and then marched her upstairs, where he proudly showed off all of his hunting collection and was just bragging on how much he loved hunting and how good he was at it. Now as he was talking and just moving around the house, Sydney had a daunting thought to her. She realized that if he's shown me all this and showed me his face, he had no intentions of keeping me alive, because if he kept me alive, I'm a huge risk to his ultimate plan. Now as she was coming up with this revelation, the man looked at her and noticed that her face was going all white, and then with that he said, let's go. So as they were walking to the car, Sydney was just thinking of ways to escape, because she knew if she did not escape now, she was probably going to get killed. So the man led Sydney to the back of his car and then opened the trunk up and then pushed her inside. And as soon as he was closing the trunk, Sydney took one more glance at the man before ultimately he would close it and everything would go black. Now 15 minutes had gone by, and now Sydney realized that the car had stopped, and then she heard the trunk opening, and then when she got out of the trunk, she realized she was at an airport. Now the man with a gun in his pocket was directing Sydney to the airplane. Sydney knew in the back of her mind that once she got into that plane, she was finished. Now the plane only had 2 seats, one for the pilot and one for the passenger. So Sydney got into the passenger seat, and so did the man, but then the man realized that he forgot something on the floor, so he went back down, and this is where Sydney knew this was her final chance. So as the man's distracted, Sydney decided that she had enough and she was just going to run for it, and that's exactly what she did. She managed to get out the hangar, and then as she was running, she saw a forest up ahead. Now as she was running, she looked back, and to her horror, the man was chasing after her and was gaining on her. So at this point, she knew she had to fully commit to the forest, or she was going to get captured again. So as she's weaving and dodging different branches and trunks, she eventually sees a road ahead, and when she sees that road, she gets a second wind of energy. But then all of a sudden, but before we continue this story, if you enjoyed it, then I'd highly suggest you subscribe and like in the video. But with all that being said, let's continue. Sydney trips and falls face first into the dirt, and now as she's lying there, all she could think about was the man catching up and grabbing her and taking her away, or even worse, shooting her straight on the spot. But seconds go by, then minutes, and she noticed that no footsteps are coming closer to her. So now she's confused and she gets up, looks around, and notices the man's gone. So now, not taking any chances, she gets another wind of energy and just sprints towards the road. And then that's when she saw the truck and flagged the truck down. When the police heard this story from Sydney, they were dumbfounded. And the way Sydney told the story and had given every single detail, the police ultimately believed her. So the police looked at her and then said, let's go to the hospital. But she wasn't having it. She demanded that we need to go back to the airport and identify the hangar. She was hoping that if they can go quick, they can identify who owns this hangar. So the police comply and they go to the airport. And Sydney points out the exact hangar that she believed she was in. And amazingly, when they got there, the plane was still there, but the man wasn't. And so the police began to take notes and started to write down different tags on the plane. And just in the background, they saw a security guard coming towards them because he was curious on why the police were over at the airport. So as the police explained that they need to have a talk with whoever owns this hangar. So as the security guard learns about this, he tells the police that the night before he had seen the owner of the plane and he was acting very strange, and it appeared that he was hiding something in his car, and on a gut feeling he decided to record the license plate of this car. And now, since his feelings came to fruition, he gave that recording to the police, and that turns out the car belonged to Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen was a very successful businessman. He owned a couple of bakeries around Anchorage. So after the police learned this information, they dropped Sydney off the hospital and went to pay a visit to Robert. So they drove to his house, and then when they got there, they saw him pulling into his own house at the exact same time, and they noticed that the car matched the exact description that Sydney gave. And when Robert got out the car, it was the exact same description that Sydney had given. So the police pulled up to Robert's house, and then they got out. Robert turned around and looked at them and was pretty surprised, but before he could say anything, the police said, we need to chat with you. So Robert, cool as a cucumber, said fine and led them into his house. And when they got inside, the police were shocked that the house looked exactly what Sydney had described, from the hunting trophies to the little nitty stuff he had. So they sat him down and then asked, what were you doing on the night before? He said with a very confident voice that he was spending some time with his friends and that he can give them the contact info just in case that they didn't believe him. So the police looked at each other and then said, can we search your property? And then he said, as cool as you can be, of course you can. So they searched the property and found nothing that showed Sydney was attacked here. So they thanked him for his hospitality and left. Once they got back to the police station, they began to ring Robert's friends to see if he was telling the truth. So they rang all of the friends up and they all said the same thing. Yes, Robert was with us at the time. And so with all that evidence, the police believed that he was telling the truth. So they went back to Sydney and said, are you sure you're telling us the truth and you're not exaggerating anything? So of course Sydney was a bit taken back and said yes, everything was truthful and nothing was exaggerated. And the police said, are you willing to take a lie detector test to prove that you're telling the truth? And that's when Sydney said no. No one knows why she said no. Some people think that she might have lost faith in the police or something else, but either way she said no. Now after she said no, there was an enormous doubt to Sydney's story, and that's when the police stopped believing her. And just after a couple of days, she must have got spooked and left the city altogether. And just like that, Robert Hansen was largely forgotten about. But 3 months later, on September 3rd, all of that changed. On that day, a construction crew was doing some work on a backcountry road not far from where those 3 bodies were found. And at one point, as they were digging, they uncovered even more human remains. Now the police were quickly called and they digged up the rest of the remains. And just like Sherry's case, they began to look around to see if there's any more evidence. And coincidentally, they found another bullet shell. It was a .223 caliber round, the same bullet type that they found in Sherry Morrow's case. They brought the body back for an autopsy and they found out that this body belonged to a female and she was shot multiple times. Using dental records, they were able to identify this woman as 17-year-old Paula Golden, who was also an exotic dancer who had gone missing 5 months prior. The police sent the .223 bullet shells that they found in Paula's gravesite. Also, they sent the shells of the other gravesites that they found, and it was quickly determined that these bullets were fired from the same rifle. So therefore, given the idea that these women died from the same person, and this was the moment that police knew they had a serial killer on their hands. Now, along with that finding, many speculations came around, and one of them was Robert, and many officers wanted to be him, but unfortunately, since he had a rock-solid alibi, and the fact that they had no evidence on him, they couldn't proceed forward against him. So in a desperate attempt, the police turned to a famous FBI profiler named John Douglas, and they asked him to build a profile on who killed these women. To give you a bit of backstory on John Douglas, he was this amazing investigator that had solved many of crimes. So he gave them a profile, a man in his late 40s who blended in easily with society and was very well liked. He got along with everybody and was ultimately a normal guy who most likely owned a successful business. He was an avid outdoorsman and liked to hunt, and he most likely had a significant significant speech defect, for example like a lisp or a stutter. So as the police were listening to this, all they could think about was Robert Hansen. So they trusted John, as he is a prolific investigator and he has a very good understanding of serial killers and how their brain works. So the police showed this evidence to a judge, who was also shocked on how similar the descriptions and Robert were. So once he heard this description, he gave the police a search warrant to Robert's house. And this time around, the police would find very damning evidence. For example, they found a map of the local area. It was a hunting map, and on the map there was 37 X's crossed off, and some of those X's coincided with some of the bodies that were found. They also found a .223 caliber rifle and a bag of women's jewellery that contained a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. As the police were carrying out this investigation, a neighbour walked by after seeing all the commotion happening, and she walked up to a police officer very skittish and anxious, and then she proceeded to say, "You know, my husband's friends with Robert, and one day Robert asked my husband to lie to the police, saying that they were with each other, but when he found out the police were coming to his house, he had no idea on how much trouble Robert was actually in, and I wanted to tell you that my husband was lying. He was not with Robert on that night." So now with that information, Robert had no alibi, and now the police were looking at this map with 37 X's, and again some coincided with the bodies that were found. So with this overwhelming evidence, they went to Robert and showed him everything. So Robert sat down, took a deep breath and said, "I'm going to confess." But there's a catch. He was willing to confess the murders to the 4 women that they found. Now the police knew at this point that he murdered more than 4, and they just wanted to know who are the other victims, and that's when they offered him a deal where if he confessed to the 4 murders and then gave additional information about the other bodies and also showed them where the bodies were, the police would only charge him for the 4 murders and they wouldn't prosecute him on the other murders. So Robert agreed to these terms and signed the deal, and then gave a full horrifying confession. In his confession he said he drove around Anchorage in the night looking for vulnerable women that were all alone, and these women were most likely exotic dancers that he was trying to befriend in the club, and he would tell these women that he was a professional photographer and he thought that they would be amazing for his shoots and would love to do one with them, and that he would also pay them for their work. And of course many of these women were aspiring models, so they accepted. So Robert would tell them to meet him the next day at a specific location. That location was a fast food restaurant where Robert would arrive really early and hide in his car and would wait to see if the women showed up by themselves or not. And to the unfortunate women that did come up by themselves, he would drive up to them and tell them to get into the car, but what they couldn't see was on the passenger door there was a handcuff that was already latched on to the door itself, and there was an open handcuff getting ready to get latched on to the woman's arm. And as soon as the woman would get into the car, he would act like he was trying to get the seatbelt on, but in one quick motion he would put the handcuff on and then pull a gun at them and tell them to be quiet. During the confession, Robert would also brag about this skill and say he was a master at handcuffing someone and pulling a gun straight away, all in one swift motion. He was saying this as like some sort of an achievement and not some cruel joke. Once he got them in cuffs, he would take them back to his house and into his basement, and then just like Sydney would chain them up and then assault them for hours on end until he got bored, and then he would decide to go upstairs and take a nap. Once he's took his nap, he would go back down to the basement, unchain the women and then take them back upstairs, and this is where he started to show off all of his hunting trophies. And once he's done that, he would toss the girls into the trunk and then take them to his hangar and then fly to his remote cabin, which where the 4 bodies were found. And once he got to the cabin, he would undress the women and then put a blindfold on them and still with the handcuffs on, and then open the door and let them run away. And of course all the girls would start running for their lives in the vast woods and would constantly run into trees or fall over branches. They would do this hoping that if they ran away quick enough they would be saved. But this is where the sick and twisted mind of Robert came out. Robert knew that there was no escape in this little island because surrounding the island was deep waters, and even if the women got out that far they would just fall and drown. So after letting the women go, Robert would get his hunting knife and rifle and began to hunt them down. He would stalk his prey for several hours or days. He would walk around these woods looking for the women, and if he found them he would watch from a far distance and see what they would do. And at some point he would sneak up behind the women and wound them on purpose with his knife, and then following the blood trail to these dying women who were just screaming for help. And at some point some women knew that they were never going to be saved, so they just collapsed to the floor. And at that point Robert knew the game was finished and would run to them and then shoot them. Once that was done, he would redress them and take the handcuffs off and then bury them in a shallow grave before being shipped off to a prison where he would serve his life sentence without a possibility of parole. He was brought out to the cabin by the authorities to try to find the other women's bodies, but unfortunately they would only find 8 more bodies. Animals have ransacked the area, or he had just simply forgotten where he buried them, or he didn't want to share any more information with the police. Robert never confirmed if all 37 X's on the map were victims of his, because in 2014 Robert died in prison and took all the information to the grave. So that's the story for today. If you're a fan of true crime stories delivered in story format, then I would highly suggest you subscribe. But thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.